Miranda had always carried a quiet strangeness that her family noticed early and never let her forget. In the manicured stillness of a Chicago suburb, where hedges were trimmed like military formations and children wore polos at backyard barbecues, she stood out. The youngest daughter in a household that prized conformity and emotional neatness, she had a gaze that lingered too long on shadows, hands that touched things gently like they held stories, and a voice that rarely rose above a murmur. While her peers filled their rooms with trophies and makeup mirrors, Miranda arranged shelves of antique books, pressed dried violets between pages, and studied the chipped corners of her great-aunt's postcards. Her fascination with solitude unnerved her relatives. They whispered about her at family gatherings, using words like moody and fragile, shaking their heads when she declined to join group games or laughed at the wrong moment. As a child, she wept openly at the funeral of the family cat, while others offered forced smiles and moved on. When she refused to speak to her cousin after being mocked for her stutter, she was labeled too sensitive, as if her boundaries were a defect. No matter how she behaved, the verdict had already been passed. Miranda was difficult, not in any dangerous way, just inconvenient. By adolescence, the label had calcified. Teachers praised her intelligence, but noted she drifted. Neighbors smiled politely, but encouraged their daughters to play elsewhere. At home, her mother tried to fix her through routines, forced social activities, monitored meals, gentle scolding disguised as concern. Her father mostly avoided confrontation, offering tired glances that said, "Why can't you just be normal?" But the deepest betrayal came from her older brother, Travis. He mocked her behind closed doors, gaslit her reactions, and called her delusional when she flinched at his cruelty. His jabs were invisible to their parents, masked by a golden boy charm that made Miranda's protests seem like overreactions. At 17, everything cracked. The pressure to conform, the loneliness, the buried humiliation, it all erupted in a panic attack during a family vacation. She locked herself in a bathroom, unable to breathe, shaking on the floor while her mother banged on the door, demanding she pull herself together. No one asked why it happened. No one considered what she had endured. Instead, the narrative was sealed. Miranda had finally snapped. From that point on, her name was often paired with muttered phrases. "She's just not right," or "You know how Miranda gets." Her attempts to speak about Travis's years of cruelty were dismissed as paranoid delusions. If she brought up therapy, her mother sighed. If she asked to be taken seriously, her father avoided eye contact. The more she tried to reclaim her reality, the more they questioned it. It was easier for them to believe she was broken than to confront what had been done to her. And so, the label remained. Not a diagnosis, but a cage. Crazy was easier to say than neglected, and far easier than abused. By the time Miranda left for college, she carried the silence like a second spine, rigid, aching, and always just beneath the surface. Miranda returned to her childhood home under the brittle pretense of duty. Her father had died quietly, slipping away in his sleep, and the call from her mother came not with grief, but with a request to help sort through the remains of a life stored in drawers, attics, and closets. It had been almost 4 years since she had last stepped across the threshold. Years that she had spent in therapy, relearning how to interpret the world without defaulting to fear, how to differentiate between discomfort and danger, how to recognize manipulation not as her failure to adapt, but as someone else's power play. The house greeted her like an exhale gone stale. The beige hallway smelled the same, like lemon polish and something faintly metallic. Her old room was locked, the key misplaced, so her mother directed her to the guest room, a space that hadn't changed in a decade. Floral wallpaper peeled slightly at the corners, and a crucifix still hung above the bed like a silent warning. She slept on unfamiliar sheets beneath a quilt that smelled of cedar and old perfume, like the lingering presence of someone long gone. At first, Miranda tried to maintain neutrality. She offered help in sorting boxes, asked logistical questions, avoided conversational traps. but the air was thick with subtext. Her mother's eyes flickered with restrained judgment whenever Miranda paused to examine a photo or held onto a letter too long. Breakfasts were laced with gentle reminders of her past shortcomings. Travis, arriving a day after her, embraced her warmly in front of relatives, but in private, he resumed his favorite sport, eroding her sense of self. He mocked her new job title with a smirk, told cousins that she was back on meds, and casually reminded their mother that Miranda's version of events was always a little dramatic. The old dynamics crept in like dampness, curling around her spine, softening her boundaries. The house, too, seemed complicit. Doors creaked just slightly after she closed them. The hallway light flickered whenever she passed. At night, she heard footsteps that no one acknowledged. Even when the guest room was still, she sensed movement, like the breath of someone watching. It wasn't fear she felt, but familiarity. This was the house where her voice had once disappeared, where her truth was questioned, where she had been taught to doubt her instincts. Now it pulsed with memory, with ghosts not of the dead, but of the living who had refused to see her. Her mother remained composed, offering tea and tired smiles, sighing pointedly when Miranda corrected her on a small detail. She spoke of Travis with warmth, praised his growing business, and mentioned his concerns about Miranda's mental health with the casual cruelty of someone delivering gossip wrapped in silk. No one asked how Miranda had been, what she had achieved, or how she had survived the years away. Instead, they discussed her in the third person, even when she was present, as though she were some complicated puzzle they had long ago given up solving. It was in that guest room, surrounded by yellowing wallpaper and the faint hum of the old ceiling fan, that Miranda began to watch instead of speak. She noticed what time her mother's tone shifted into passive aggression. She clocked how Travis changed his posture depending on who entered the room. She listened for the moments when the mask slipped, however briefly. Her journal filled with observations, not emotions. It became clear they didn't want her healed. They needed her to be broken. It made their version of the past easier to digest. She stared at herself in the mirror one night and finally understood. If they needed her to be the crazy one to preserve their story, then so be it. But this time, she would be the author of the madness. Not a victim of distortion, but the architect of illusion. The decision wasn't dramatic or even emotional. It arrived like gravity. If this house demanded ghosts, she would give them a haunting they'd never forget. Miranda's first movements were quiet, almost imperceptible. She understood the language of subtlety better than anyone in the house. She knew that real fear wasn't loud. It crept in through the corners, questioned your certainty, rewrote your memories. So she began with something simple. The photograph on the staircase wall, a smiling family portrait taken 3 decades earlier, had always hung at a precise angle, centered between the banister and the light switch. One morning, it was flipped upside down. No one mentioned it aloud, but she noticed the brief pause in her mother's step as she passed it. No one corrected it. That was the first seed. In the following days, she targeted objects with long histories. A porcelain swan figurine disappeared from the mantel, reappearing days later in the attic. The set of heirloom teaspoons, always neatly nested in the kitchen drawer, had one missing, then 2. Then all were returned, arranged perfectly except for one that faced the opposite direction. Old clocks that had not ticked in years suddenly resumed their slow, wheezing movement. The pendulum in the dining room swung again, even though its inner gears had been rusted stiff for over a decade. She had repaired it weeks in advance, cleaned and oiled it in secret, and inserted a hidden motor triggered by a phone in her pocket. She programmed Bluetooth speakers, small, discreet black discs, no bigger than a coaster, and hid them behind books, inside flower pots, beneath the lip of a cabinet. They played faint, disjointed recordings she had crafted herself. A girl laughing, barefoot footsteps on linoleum. A woman humming the melody of a forgotten lullaby. The sounds activated on timers between 2:47 and 3:11 a.m., when the house was its most silent and vulnerable. The disturbances were too soft to wake everyone, but loud enough for someone with a guilty conscience. Travis began to notice first. He started mentioning odd occurrences at breakfast. He described muffled noises at night, objects shifting in his peripheral vision, a shadow moving past the bathroom door when no one else was awake. His words were laced with nervous laughter, but the twitch at the corner of his eye betrayed something deeper. He began sleeping with the hallway light on, something he hadn't done since childhood. Miranda played innocent, brushing crumbs from her lap, keeping her gaze low as if disinterested. But in her journal, she noted the change in his posture, the new tension in his voice. Each illusion built upon the last. She planted thin strands of hair, her own, on his pillow, placed at odd angles as if someone had stood over him while he slept. She turned the thermostat down slightly each night so the house grew cold just before dawn. The scent of lavender oil, something their grandmother once wore, was diffused sporadically through air vents in timed bursts. Memories became weapons. The past, once dismissed, returned as a quiet invasion. Travis's complaints escalated. He claimed he saw someone standing at the end of the hall. He said he heard whispering near his bedroom door. Their mother dismissed him, suggesting he was tired, overworked, imagining things. She smiled with weary affection, the same expression she had worn when Miranda was a teenager, trembling from anxiety attacks. Now it was Travis's turn to be doubted, to feel the slow unraveling of his grip on reality. Miranda watched him closely, not with vengeance, but with precision. She wasn't just creating chaos. She was building a stage, writing the first act of a play only she knew was unfolding. The house itself had become her accomplice, and the show had just begun. The second phase of Miranda's plan began with language, the kind that didn't need a voice. In the early hours of a Monday morning, a message appeared on the fogged bathroom mirror after her brother's shower. The words were simple, jagged, and large enough to feel intrusive. Lies live here. The steam curled around the letters like breath holding a secret. Travis saw it first, staring into his own reflection as it faded behind the message. He rubbed at the glass, then at his eyes, then left the bathroom without a word. By the next day, another appeared. He lied to you. Then, do you hear it? Miranda wrote each one herself with a gloved hand, mimicking a style of handwriting she copied from old family recipes, familiar but untraceable. The notes escalated slowly. Small slips of paper hidden in drawers read like riddles. Sticky notes placed beneath pillows held single words in capital letters. Remember, watch, soon. Her timing was careful. She used moments of solitude, when her mother took her evening walk, when Travis left to run errands. The house itself became a living maze of unease. One night, Miranda planted a note inside the refrigerator. I see what you did. Her mother found it while reaching for milk. Another note was tucked into the back of a book Travis kept on his nightstand. By then, their nerves were thinning like the edges of a worn rug. Their conversations grew clipped. Their glances lingered too long on corners, doorways, shadows. The sense of safety within the house cracked like old paint. To amplify the effect, Miranda resumed the soundscape. The faint hum of lullabies distorted just enough to feel uncanny, set to play at irregular intervals during the night. A whisper layered into the hum suggested breathing, as though someone stood just behind the walls. She used a mirror in the hallway, tinted with a fine coating of two-way film, to manipulate reflections in dim light. It was barely noticeable during the day, but at night it caught movement and warped it, making shadows seem to breathe. One evening, Travis fled the house barefoot, claiming he saw his reflection blink when he hadn't. He returned hours later, pale and shaking, eyes darting to every surface as if the walls had begun to whisper. Their mother, once a master of control and dismissal, began waking in the middle of the night screaming. She claimed to hear footsteps in the attic, though they had nailed it shut years ago. She complained of a constant draft in the dining room, a coldness that seemed to gather near Miranda's seat. An electrician was called to inspect the wiring. A locksmith checked the basement door for tampering. A neighbor was asked if they had seen anyone lurking near the windows. Nothing came of it. The house, as far as others could tell, was fine. But inside, the tension wound tighter each day. Through it all, Miranda played her part. She allowed her hands to tremble. She spoke less and watched more. She left her own journal half open on her nightstand, pages filled with jumbled entries, incorrect dates, and dreamlike recollections. She wanted them to think her confused, disoriented, emotionally unstable. At breakfast, she asked questions she already knew the answer to. She stared into her coffee too long, blinked as though startled by her name. It was subtle, but effective. She didn't want them to know she was in control. She wanted them to believe they were losing theirs. Her plan required their doubt, their fear, their inability to trust even their own eyes. Each gesture, each sound, each misdirection was calibrated like a piece in a psychological chess game. What they perceived as unraveling was for her the most lucid she had ever felt. This was not the descent into madness. This was strategy, precision, justice, crafted in whispers and shadows. When the tension in the house reached its breaking point, when every flickering light became a warning, every creak of the floor a threat, and silence itself carried a pulse, Miranda knew it was time for the final act. The house no longer felt like a home, but a sealed chamber, saturated with suspicion. Her mother moved through the rooms like a ghost of her former self, stiff with sleep deprivation and jumpy at the slightest sound. Travis had grown pale and withdrawn, his swagger replaced by darting glances and clenched jaws. The once smug voice now barely rose above a murmur. It was late December when Miranda prepared her exit. She wrapped the boxes carefully, using festive paper and silver ribbons, placing them under the artificial tree in the corner of the living room. The ornaments shimmered with fragile nostalgia, but the gifts beneath them were anything but sentimental. Each box was addressed by hand, one for her mother, one for her brother, and one, smaller and unmarked, for the space between them, the unspoken past. Inside the boxes were years of curated evidence. Printed screenshots of text messages in which Travis painted Miranda as unstable, unreliable, erratic. She had saved every word, every sarcastic comment disguised as concern, every convenient lie sent late at night or slipped into casual chats. Among the documents was a USB drive containing audio recordings, captured from conversations he never knew she heard. His voice laughing, bragging to a friend about how easy it was to steer their mother's opinion. How all it took was the right tone, a concerned expression, and a few reminders about Miranda's mental health history. He laughed while calling her a ticking time bomb, a disaster waiting to happen. And he said it with pride. There were letters, too. Handwritten notes from college years she had once hidden in a box, where Travis spoke about her in cruel terms to a family friend, suggesting she was on the verge of a breakdown and needed intervention, all while angling for sympathy and admiration for being the strong one in a complicated family. The documents spanned nearly a decade. Each piece alone was unsettling. Together, they formed a portrait not of a mentally unstable sister, but of a manipulative son who weaponized perception. At the very top of each box was a sealed envelope. It contained a single page, handwritten by Miranda in slow, deliberate script. It read, "You wanted to see madness, but what you saw was control. You wanted to believe I was broken, but I was simply watching. You needed a scapegoat, so I became your mirror. Look carefully now, not at me, but at yourselves." She didn't wait for them to find the gifts. She left the house before dawn, her car already packed, engine humming beneath the frost. She didn't leave a forwarding address or a goodbye. No drama, no confrontation. Just the sound of her tires rolling away from the curb as the sun began to rise. Behind her, the house sat in stillness. Within its walls, everything remained intact. furniture undisturbed, lights dimmed, decorations glinting in the early light. But beneath the surface, nothing was untouched. Every illusion had been stripped, every denial cracked open. What remained was not a haunted house, but a family exposed under glass, held in place by their own reflections, unable to look away. 2 months had passed since Miranda left the house on the quiet street where her childhood had been dissected and repackaged into polite myths. Now she lived in a city where no one knew her past, where the air moved differently, and the architecture didn't hold memories in every corner. Her apartment sat high above the ground, with wide windows that caught the sun in long golden slants. The rooms were filled with soft fabrics, open space, and green plants that flourished without effort. For the first time in years, the silence inside her home felt gentle instead of loaded. There were no footsteps in the hallway at night, no whispered doubts muttered under breath, no eyes waiting for her to falter. Her days found rhythm in simplicity: quiet mornings with coffee and unread books, long walks with no destination, evenings spent tracing the light across her ceiling as it faded into dusk. She returned to her work slowly, sketching forms and spaces not just with purpose, but with care, as if rebuilding herself one structure at a time. The anxiety that once gnawed at her edges had softened, like static fading from a frequency too long disrupted. Occasionally, her phone buzzed with messages from the past. A short, "I'm sorry" from her mother. A confused, "We didn't know" from her brother. A bitter, "How could you do this?" that came late at night and went unread. She never replied. The silence between them was no longer heavy with shame. It was clarity. Their confusion no longer belonged to her. Their regret, real or performative, arrived too late to matter. She had waited years for their recognition, and when it came, it no longer held power. She understood now that madness had always been a word others used to contain what they didn't want to confront. Her sadness, her anger, her truth. It had been too inconvenient for them to hold. Easier to call her unstable than to admit they had hurt her. Easier to deny her voice than to hear what it said about them. That realization didn't come with fury or triumph, but with quiet steadiness. She didn't need to rewrite their narrative. She only needed to stop living inside it. Each morning she passed a mirror near the kitchen, once a site of doubt, now a place of calm reflection. The woman staring back at her no longer seemed fractured. Her eyes were alert, her shoulders relaxed, her mouth no longer drawn into apology. She looked like someone who had walked through fire and decided not to look back. There was no revenge in her posture, only release. She smiled, not for performance, not for proof, but because she meant it. Normalcy, she realized, had never been about conforming to their idea of her. It had always been about choosing to live outside their illusions. In this quiet space, with the windows open and the plants breathing gently in the sunlight, Miranda felt whole, not because anyone told her she was, but because she no longer asked them to.